They cuffed me, the director of the CIA, to my own car like I was some petty thief. The crowd recorded the spectacle while the smug cop basked in his moment of glory, completely unaware he was digging his own grave. He thought he was in control, but trust me, this was just the beginning. My name is Benjamin Hart. I'm 52 years old and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Sounds impressive, right? You'd think a title like that would shield me from injustice. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Life has a twisted sense of humor, and that day it decided to turn mine into a full-blown circus. The day started like any other: early morning calls, endless meetings, and a mountain of paperwork that could probably crush a lesser man. I had just wrapped up a critical discussion with the Secretary of Defense, hammering out strategies for counter-terrorism operations. With my crisp navy suit and polished black shoes, I looked every bit the part. My mind was already running through the rest of the day's to-do list as I walked toward my car, parked just outside our headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It was a breezy afternoon, with the sun casting a golden hue over the parking lot. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I felt it, that uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I glanced up, and there he was, a police officer standing a few steps from my car. White, mid-40s, buzz cut, arms crossed like he was auditioning for a role in a cop drama. His eyes were locked on me, dissecting every move I made like I was some kind of threat. It was the kind of stare that makes your skin crawl. I kept walking, pretending not to notice, but as soon as I got close, he stepped forward. His movements were sharp, deliberate, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "ID, now," he barked, his voice curt, his tone authoritarian, zero respect. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me, officer. May I ask what this is about?" I kept my voice calm and steady. Years of training had taught me how to handle tense situations. But this felt different. "You're acting suspicious," he shot back without so much as a blink. "Suspicious? Really?" I was in a tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase in one of the most secure locations in the country. What part of that screamed suspicious? I bit back the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. "Benjamin Hart, director of the CIA," I said, holding up my ID for him to see. You'd think that would be enough to clear things up. You'd think wrong. His eyes barely flicked over the ID before his jaw tightened. "Hands on the hood," he barked, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. At first, I thought it was a joke, a really bad one. "Officer," I began, keeping my tone measured. "You do realize who I am, don't you?" He didn't flinch. "On the hood. Now." His hand hovered near his holster, a clear threat he didn't need to vocalize. By now, a small crowd had gathered. People stopped mid-stride, whispering to each other, their phones already recording. Someone shouted, "Do you even know who that is?" Another voice chimed in, "That's the director of the CIA." But the officer didn't care. His face was stone, his intent clear. He wasn't here for a conversation. He was here to prove a point. I placed my hands on the hood of my car, feeling the cold metal under my palms. The officer's handcuffs clicked around my wrists, sharp and unforgiving. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Inside, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, humiliation, disbelief. But I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They shoved me against the hood of my own car, like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. The cold metal pressed against my palms while the handcuffs dug into my wrists. Let me tell you, it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was infuriating. But I knew I had to keep my cool. Losing it now would only give this officer exactly what he wanted: a reason to escalate. The crowd around us kept growing. People were stopping in their tracks, whispering to each other, pointing, and of course, recording everything on their phones. You could hear the buzz of indignation building. One woman shouted, "Are you seriously arresting him? He's the director of the CIA." Another man yelled, "Hey, officer, ever heard of due process?" But the cop was stone-faced. He acted like he was starring in his own action movie, completely oblivious to how ridiculous this whole situation looked. "Officer, do you realize you're violating multiple federal laws right now?" I said, turning my head just enough to meet his eyes. My voice was calm, but trust me, I wasn't feeling calm. "Shut up," he snapped, shoving me back toward the car with more force than necessary. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "What's wrong with you?" Others started chanting, Let him go! Let him go! Meanwhile, the officer just kept going through his little performance, as if the growing mob and dozens of camera phones didn't exist. It was painfully clear he was more interested in flexing his authority than in doing his job. Checking my ID? Nope. Listening to reason? Absolutely not. People began uploading the videos in real time. I overheard someone say, "This is going to blow up online. Just watch." Hashtags like hack illegal arrest and abuse of power were already trending within minutes. The officer, though, seemed completely oblivious. If anything, he was enjoying himself, playing the role of a hero taking down an enemy. After what felt like an eternity, he yanked me away from my car and marched me toward the patrol car. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, their phones still aimed squarely at us. The murmurs were getting louder, the outrage palpable. "Are you sure about this, officer?" I asked, my tone steady but sharp. He didn't answer, just opened the back door and practically shoved me inside. The door slammed shut, and I could see people gathering around, pressing closer to get a better view of the spectacle. The ride to the station was awkwardly silent. The officer glanced at me in the rearview mirror a few times, his expression still unreadable. If he had any idea of the storm he was unleashing, he didn't show it. Once we arrived at the station, they led me inside, like I was some kind of high-profile fugitive. They sat me down on a rock-hard chair in the booking area, and the officer got to work filling out paperwork. But here's the thing. His colleagues were starting to notice. You could see it in their faces, the side glances, the furrowed brows. A few of them whispered to each other, and I caught bits and pieces. "Wait, that's who? And does he know what he's doing?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. The officer who arrested me was still puffed up, acting like he just made the bust of the century. But the others looked uneasy. Some of them started pulling out their phones, checking something, probably the videos that were already going viral. I sat there, calm on the outside, but fuming on the inside. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much. Here I was, the director of the CIA, being treated like a common criminal by someone who clearly hadn't done his homework. And the irony? It was all being documented for the world to see. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about accountability, about exposing what happens when power goes unchecked. And judging by the looks on the faces of his colleagues, they were starting to realize this was about to become a very big problem for all the wrong people. It all flipped in an instant. About 30 minutes into my detainment, as they like to call it, the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I sat there, still cuffed, watching the chaos unravel around me. The officers were whispering among themselves, sneaking glances at me like I was holding some kind of secret grenade. Spoiler alert, I was. Then it happened. The station phone rang, and you could tell from the way the desk sergeant's face fell that this wasn't a casual, "How's your day?" call. His posture stiffened, and he almost tripped over his own chair as he got up to fetch the officer who'd arrested me. A minute later, the guy, let's just call him Officer Overconfidence, got the earful of a lifetime. "Are you out of your mind?" the sergeant hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "You arrested the director of the CIA. What were you thinking?" The officer's swagger evaporated faster than a puddle in the summer heat. He stammered something incoherent, something about suspicious behavior and just doing his job. Yeah, sure, because handcuffing a federal official in a suit screams good policing. At this point, every other officer in the room had stopped pretending to work. They were all watching this disaster unfold, their faces a mix of disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. Someone muttered, "This is going to end badly," and let me tell you, they weren't wrong. "Get him out of those cuffs." "Now," barked the sergeant, pointing at me like I was a ticking time bomb. Officer Overconfidence fumbled with the key, his hands shaking. When he finally managed to unlock the cuffs, I stood up, adjusted my suit, and gave him the kind of look that could make a grown man rethink all his life choices. "Apologies, sir," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "It was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you're going with?" The room fell silent. Nobody dared to say a word. The officer's face turned a lovely shade of crimson as he realized there was no way to salvage this. "Sir, please accept our apologies," the sergeant chimed in, clearly trying to do some damage control. This was an unfortunate mistake. Oh, it was more than unfortunate, I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. But don't worry, I'll make sure it's corrected. And with that, I walked out of the station. But if they thought this was over, they clearly underestimated who they were dealing with. The second I got back to my office, I called an emergency meeting. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a system that allowed people like Officer Overconfidence to run wild without consequences. And I wasn't about to let it slide. Here's what we're doing, I said, addressing my team. We're digging into this officer's record. Every complaint, every report, every questionable decision he's made. I want it all. It didn't take long for the dirt to surface. Turns out, Officer Overconfidence had a history. Unlawful arrests, excessive use of force, fabricated charges, the works. And the kicker? Most of these complaints had mysteriously disappeared from the official records. Suspicious, right? Not really. It was all too common in cases like this. But it wasn't just him. His supervisor, the same sergeant who tried to smooth things over, was just as guilty. Covering up complaints, intimidating witnesses, sweeping problems under the rug. It was practically a side hustle for him. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. There were financial records linking them to shady deals, whistleblowers who came forward with stories of systemic abuse, and even an unofficial watch list targeting minorities and activists. This wasn't just a rogue officer problem. It was an institutional rot that had festered for years. By the time we wrapped up the initial investigation, we had enough evidence to fill a library. But I wasn't stopping there. This needed to go public. I contacted a few trusted journalists, people who wouldn't shy away from exposing the truth. Within days, headlines about police corruption and abuse of power were plastered across every major news outlet. The public reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage. People started sharing their own stories of mistreatment, demanding accountability. Protests erupted in front of the station, with signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No one is above the law." As for Officer Overconfidence and his supervisor, let's just say their careers were circling the drain, and the plug was about to be pulled. The fallout from this incident was nothing short of a wildfire. Once we had all the evidence locked and loaded, we marched straight to federal court. There was no room for hesitation. This wasn't just about one rogue officer or a poorly managed precinct. It was about a system that had been left unchecked for far too long. The media, of course, went into overdrive. Every major network picked up the story, and the headlines were scathing. CIA director wrongfully arrested, a tale of abuse of power and corruption in the force. Journalists were relentless, interviewing anyone and everyone with a connection to the case. It felt like the entire country was watching, waiting for justice to be served. And then the public stepped in. Social media lit up like a Christmas tree. Hashtags like #AccountabilityNow and Justice for All were trending for weeks. But it wasn't just noise. People were sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, of being silenced, overlooked, or outright ignored by the very system meant to protect them. The outcry grew louder, and protests erupted in cities across the country. Signs reading "No justice, no peace" and "Equal rights, equal laws" filled the streets. It was clear this wasn't just my fight anymore. This was a collective demand for change. A few weeks later, the gavel finally came down. The officer who had so proudly paraded me in handcuffs was officially terminated and permanently barred from working in law enforcement. His supervisor didn't fare any better. He was stripped of his rank, publicly disgraced, and forced into early retirement. But the repercussions didn't stop there. The entire precinct was put under review, leading to a full-scale reorganization. Policies were rewritten, accountability measures were put in place, and mandatory training programs were introduced to address bias and abuse of power. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a reckoning. For me, the experience was a harsh reminder that no one is immune to injustice, no matter their title or status. I had spent my entire career fighting for fairness, only to find myself on the receiving end of its absence. But this wasn't just about me. It was about exposing the cracks in the system and doing something to fix them. Looking back, I see this as more than just a personal victory. It was a win for everyone who's ever been ignored or mistreated by the system. It was proof that accountability is not just a word. It's an action, a movement, a demand for something better. Change doesn't happen overnight, but this was a start. And if there's one thing I know, it's that even the smallest ripple can create a wave.